The way she held her wine glass told me everything I needed to know about how the evening was going to go. My sister Brianna had this habit. She'd lift her glass just slightly higher than necessary whenever she wanted people to notice her wrist. Tonight, that wrist had a bracelet on it. Not just any bracelet. White gold, with a small row of diamonds that caught the candlelight every time she moved. Our mother had given it to her that afternoon. Apparently. A just because gift. I'd found out from our aunt, not from Mum. That was pretty standard, to be honest. I'm Cassidy Vane. I'm 31 years old. I run a boutique investment firm. I started from scratch at 23, and until the night of my parents' 30th anniversary dinner at a restaurant in Queenstown, most of my family had absolutely no idea. Not because I hid it exactly, more because nobody ever asked. The restaurant was called Air, one of those places with low lighting and menus without prices, perched right on the edge of the Remarkable's view. Dad had booked it 3 months in advance. 12 of us at a long table, Mum and Dad at the heads, Brianna and her fiancé Marcus to Dad's right, me somewhere in the middle next to my Aunt Rosemary and my cousin Drew, who kept nudging me and quietly rating the bread rolls out of 10. "This one's an 8, he whispered, passing me the basket. "Good crust, slightly underseasoned." 7.5, I whispered back. "You're generous." It was the most comfortable I'd felt all evening. The thing about family dinners, when you're the one nobody quite understands, is that you learn to create small pockets of ease wherever you can find them. Drew was mine. He was 2 years younger than me, worked in marine biology down in Dunedin, and had long since opted out of the family hierarchy, the same way I had though, for different reasons. He just genuinely didn't care. I cared. Once. I'd stopped. Mostly. But that night, something about the way the candlelight hit Brianna's bracelet kept pulling at something old inside me. Mum was glowing. That's the only word for it. She'd worn the navy dress she saves for occasions she considers important, and she kept reaching across the table to squeeze Dad's hand, and it was genuinely lovely to watch. They'd been married 30 years, and they still looked at each other like they'd made a good decision. I'll always give them that. Brianna had worn a cream silk blouse and had her hair done properly, which meant she'd known the bracelet was coming and had dressed for the occasion of receiving it. Marcus sat beside her, looking pleasantly comfortable, the way men who come from money tend to look in expensive restaurants. Not impressed exactly, just at ease, like the linen napkins and the 3-page wine list were simply the correct baseline for an evening. Marcus was a good person, actually. That's the complicated bit. He was kind to waitstaff, he remembered people's names. He'd once quietly organized for flowers to be delivered to my aunt after her hip surgery without telling anyone. I didn't dislike him. I just noticed, sometimes, that his family's wealth had become my sister's primary achievement in our parents' eyes, which wasn't really fair to either of them. Brianna herself was 34. She'd done a communications degree, worked in PR for a few years, then met Marcus at a charity gala when she was 27, and had been building what she called her lifestyle brand, ever since an Instagram account with 80,000 followers, occasional brand partnerships, a lot of flat lays involving artisan coffee and weekend markets. She was genuinely good at it. She had an eye for things, but she hadn't, as far as I knew, ever sat alone at 23 years old in a 1-bedroom flat in Wellington with a second-hand laptop and a spreadsheet she'd been refining for 6 months and made a phone call to a stranger, asking for a chance to manage $50,000 of someone else's money. I had. The entree arrived. Scallops for most of us. The conversation settled into its comfortable grooves. Marcus's family's upcoming ski trip, the renovation Mum and Dad were finally doing on the deck, Brianna's potential collaboration with a home goods label that she was being deliberately vague about in the way people are when they want you to ask follow-up questions. Cassidy. My mother's voice came down the table with that particular warmth that means she's about to say something about work in the tone people use for hobbies. How's the finance stuff going? Really well, I said. Busy at the moment, actually. She's always busy, Dad said fondly, in a way that somehow made it sound like I was spinning plates for fun rather than running a company. You should talk to Marcus about it, Brianna said, not unkindly, gesturing toward her fiancé. He knows heaps of people in finance. Marcus smiled at me across the table. I smiled back. He had no idea what I did, and I didn't feel the need to explain it over scallops. Drew nudged me. I gave the scallops an 8. The main course was lamb for most people. The conversation had shifted. Dad was telling a story about the early days of his building company, one I'd heard several times, but still liked, about a job in Christchurch, where everything had gone sideways, and how he and his business partner had turned it around. Dad was a good storyteller. He had that ability to make struggle sound like character rather than failure, which is a genuinely useful skill in a person. I watched Mum watching him tell it, and thought about how much of my drive had come from them, actually. Not from their expectations, from their example. Dad building something from nothing. Mum going back to study part-time at 40 to get her nursing qualification because she'd always wanted to and finally decided to stop waiting for a good time. Those things had shaped me quietly. It was about 40 minutes into the main course that Dad set down his fork, glanced at Mum with the particular look they have when they've planned something together, and cleared his throat. The table softened into attention. "Your mum and I want to say something," he said. 30 years is a long time, and we're proud of what we've built together, the two of us, but we're also proud of our girls. He looked at Brianna first, then at me, and his eyes were warm, and I felt, briefly, the 8-year-old version of myself sit up very straight. "We've been thinking a lot lately about the future," Mum said, picking up the thread the way they do, seamlessly, after 30 years. "About making sure we're intentional about how we support both of you." I didn't feel anything particular yet. It was nice, normal. "Brianna," Dad said, "you've worked really hard to build something with Marcus. You've found your path. You're getting married next spring. You're building a home. And your mother and I want to be part of that foundation." Brianna made a small sound, pressing her hand to her chest. "We've decided to release the property fund early," Mum said. "The one we set aside when you girls were teenagers. We're allocating it in full to Brianna, to go toward the house you two are building in Arrowtown." There it was. I set down my fork very quietly. "There's still the portion we'd set aside for Cassidy," Dad continued, and I noticed his voice shift slightly careful now, like he was navigating something. "But honestly, love, you've always been so independent. You've never asked us for anything. And we thought with Brianna's wedding, the build, the timing of it, we thought it made more sense for it to go where it was needed most right now," Mum finished. The table was quiet for a moment. My Aunt Rosemary made a small movement beside me that wasn't quite looking at me and wasn't quite not. Drew very gently placed one hand on the table near mine. Not touching, just near. Brianna was looking at her plate. To her credit, she wasn't smiling. She looked slightly uncomfortable, which I appreciated. I took a sip of water. "So, just to make sure I understand," I said, and my voice came out calm, which surprised me. "You're reallocating my portion of the property fund to Brianna's house build?" "We knew you'd understand," Mum said, with a relief in her voice that told me she'd been anxious about this part of the evening. "You've always been sensible about money." "We're not cutting you out," Dad added quickly. "If you ever need anything, if things get difficult, if you want to buy a place, eventually you come to us. That conversation is always open." "If things get difficult." I looked at my father. 61 years old, salt and pepper hair, the same steady hands that had built a business and a family, and a 30-year marriage. I loved him. I genuinely loved him. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully articulated before. He didn't know me. He had never quite known who I was, since I'd stopped being the version of me that needed him to. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was something more like a long, slow exhalation. Like a held breath I'd been carrying for years, finally leaving my body. "I appreciate you telling me," I said. Mum smiled, visibly relieved. Dad nodded. Someone down the table picked up a new thread of conversation. Something about the Arrowtown build, the section they'd found. The architect Marcus's family had recommended. I picked up my fork and finished my lamb. It was Rosemary who leaned toward me about 10 minutes later, under the noise of the table, and said quietly, "You all right?" "Completely," I said. "You don't have to be," she said. "I know." I looked at her, "but I actually am. I'll explain later." She gave me a long look, and then nodded and went back to her duck confit. It was during dessert, a shared pavlova. Very good, New Zealand. Doing what New Zealand does best, that Marcus asked me a question directly. He'd been careful with me all evening, I'd noticed, in the way perceptive people are careful when they sense a current beneath the surface. "So, Cassidy," he said, "I've been meaning to ask. Your firm, what sector are you focused on right now?" Dad looked up. Mum turned slightly. I could have deflected. I almost did. But something had shifted in me over the lamb, and I found I didn't particularly want to deflect anymore. "Predominantly growth stage tech companies," I said, with a secondary focus on clean energy infrastructure. "We've had a strong run in that space over the last 3 years." Marcus's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just the particular recalibration of someone who recognizes the language. "What size fund?" he asked, and his voice was professionally neutral in a way that meant the question was genuine. "We closed our third fund last year," I said. 140 million. The table hadn't gone quiet exactly, but it had changed texture. Dad had set down his spoon. "Sorry," Mum said, with a small laugh that wasn't quite a laugh. "Did you say $140 million fund?" I said. "Yes." "That's your fund?" Dad said. "I manage it, yes. I have a team of 7. We're based in Wellington, but I travel a lot. Auckland, Sydney, Singapore, mainly." There was a silence that felt nothing like the silence after the announcement about the property fund. That silence had been smooth, planned, absorbed quickly. This one had texture. "Cassidy," Mum said, and her voice had gone very careful. "Why have you never told us any of this?" I thought about that question for a moment. Really thought about it. "You never asked," I said. Not unkindly, just accurately. I watched that land. It was true. My mother, who called Brianna every 3 days and followed her Instagram and asked detailed questions about the Arrowtown house plans, could not have told you the name of my company. My father, who had talked to Marcus for 2 hours at Christmas about Marcus's family's commercial property portfolio, had never once asked me to walk him through what I did. It wasn't malice. I want to be honest about that. It was assumption. They had assumed I was fine. Financially, professionally, personally, because I had never presented them with a crisis, and so they had redirected their attention to the places where they felt more needed. "We thought," Dad started. "You thought I was just getting by," I said. "Doing something niche, something small." He didn't deny it. "I'm not angry about it," I told him. And this was important to me, to say clearly. "But I want to be honest with you tonight, because I think we're past the age where pretending serves either of us." I reached into my bag and took out my phone. Not dramatically, not slowly, to build suspense. Just normally, the way you'd check a message. I opened my portfolio dashboard and set it on the table in front of Mum and Dad where they could both see it. The number on the screen was not $67 million. It was more than that. But the number doesn't matter as much as what my father's face did when he saw it. He went very still. The kind of still that happens when your understanding of something fundamental has to rebuild itself from the ground up. "That's Mum, stopped. That's my current personal net position," I said. "Not the fund. That's mine." Dad looked at me for a long moment. "When?" "The building started at 23, I said. "The fund launched when I was 26. I've been doing this for 8 years. 8 years, he repeated. 8 years. Marcus was leaning back in his chair with the expression of someone who had suspected something and had just been handed confirmation. He said nothing, which I respected. Brianna was looking at me, and her expression was the one I will remember most from that evening. It wasn't jealousy, exactly. It was something more complicated recognition, maybe. She knew, better than my parents did, how hard I worked. She'd watched it, in the years we'd shared a home, the early mornings, the late nights, the years I hadn't taken a holiday because I couldn't afford to lose the momentum. She hadn't understood it, but she'd seen it. "Bree," I said to her, "I want you to know I don't have any issue with the property fund. Genuinely, use it for the build. That money will mean more for what you're doing than it ever would for me." She blinked. "Cass, I mean it," I said. "I just don't want Mum and Dad spending the next however many years feeling like they need to compensate me or worrying that they've done something wrong. I'm good. I've been good for a while." Dad put his hands flat on the table. He was a man who processed things physically. When something big moved through him, he steadied himself. I'd always known that about him. "We didn't know," he said. No, I agreed. You didn't. We should have asked. Yes, I said. You should have. The honesty of that, the plainness of it, the lack of cruelty, but also the lack of softening, seemed to do something important. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a performance. It was two people who loved each other, acknowledging a real thing. Mum had tears in her eyes. I feel like I don't know you, she said quietly. You know me, I told her. You just know the parts I bring to these dinners. There are other parts. Rosemary, beside me, made a small sound that I think was her trying not to smile. Drew reached across and gave my arm a single, brief squeeze, and then went back to his pavlova. The rest of the evening shifted. Not awkwardly, more like a window had been opened in a room that had been closed for too long. Dad asked me real questions for the first time in years. Not how's the finance stuff, but actual questions. How did I choose which companies to back? What had been my biggest mistake? How did I manage a team? He was a builder, a business person. When he finally turned his full attention to what I'd built, he met it with real curiosity, and I found, to my own surprise, that I loved talking to him about it. Marcus and I had a separate conversation, later, over coffee, that covered 30 minutes and 3 topics, and felt like the beginning of a professional respect that had been waiting for years to have its excuse. Brianna pulled me aside when we were getting our coats. I didn't know, she said. I know you didn't. Are you sure are you actually okay about the money? Because if it's a problem, Bri. I touched her arm. Buy your house. Be happy. That's what the money's for. She hugged me, suddenly, tightly, and I hugged her back, and understood that we had never really been rivals, my sister and I. We had just been two people shaped differently by the same family, placed on different tracks early, and never quite given the space to find each other off them. Outside, the Queenstown night was cold and clear, and the Remarkables were dark outlines against a sky thick with stars. I stood for a moment while everyone sorted cars and said goodbyes, and I breathed the air and felt something I can only describe as clean. Rosemary came to stand beside me. You've been carrying that for a while, she said. Not really, I said. I wasn't waiting to tell them. I just stopped needing to. What changed tonight? I thought about the bracelet catching the candlelight. The careful announcement. The phrase, if things get difficult. I realized they'd made a decision about who I was without asking me, I said. And at 31, I think I'm allowed to correct the record. She laughed quietly. You're very much your father's daughter. I know, I said. He just didn't see it. Dad appeared at my shoulder then, keys in hand, and he put his arm around me, the way he used to when I was small. When I'd fall asleep on the couch and he'd scoop me up and carry me to bed, and he said nothing for a moment, just held on. Then he said, I want to hear more. About all of it. Will you come for dinner next week? Just us? Yes, I said. I'd like that. I drove back to my hotel alone. It wasn't a sad drive. I had the window down despite the cold, and I played a playlist I'd had since I was 24, the one I used to play on the early morning commutes, in the years when I had everything staked on something no one around me quite believed in yet. The thing about being a woman who builds quietly is that the building is real, even when no one's watching. The work doesn't require an audience to count. The choices compound whether or not anyone in your family has thought to ask about them. I hadn't walked into that restaurant wanting to prove anything. I'd gone for my parents' anniversary, for the pavlova, for Drew's bread roll ratings. What happened was simply that the truth had run out of reasons to stay quiet. I've thought about that evening a lot since then. About what I would say to a younger version of myself, 23, alone in that Wellington flat, building something in the dark. I think I'd say this. The people who love you are not always capable of seeing you clearly. That's not always cruelty. Sometimes it's just the limit of their imagination about who you might become, shaped by the version of you they knew before you became it. You cannot build yourself in someone else's field of vision. You have to be willing to grow in the dark, without applause, without the reassurance that anyone is watching and approving. The work is the work. The numbers are the numbers. Your worth is not contingent on being witnessed. There will come a day, and it comes at different times for different people, when you will sit at a table where you have been underestimated, and you will have a choice. You can perform your value in a way that demands their recognition, Or you can simply exist in the fullness of what you've built, calmly, without needing them to catch up. The second one is quieter, but it stays with you longer. And one more thing, because I think it matters. When the people who overlooked you finally turn around, and often, they do resist the temptation to make them feel small for being late. The goal was never to diminish them. The goal was to know your own worth so thoroughly that their timeline no longer governed yours. Let them in when they come. Set honest terms, but let them in. The hardest and most important thing I did that night at Orer wasn't showing my father the number on that screen. It was saying, "You should have asked," and then, immediately afterward, saying, "Tell me what you want to know." That's the full truth of it. That's what I learned from 30 years of watching my parents love each other well, even when they loved me imperfectly. Love and clarity can coexist. The table is still worth sitting at. The pavlova is still an 8 out of 10. And the remarkables, on a cold, clear night, are still the most beautiful thing I've ever seen from the outside of a restaurant I was never supposed to belong in. I belonged in it. I always did.